So, welcome back to all our viewers as we continue our Greek Bicentennial Historic Panel Series, hosted by Greece 200 in collaboration with the Sons of Pericles. Our last panels in the fall took us around the different regions in Greece and explained their contribution to the revolution. For the month of February, we'll continue that discussion by moving beyond Greek borders, discussing the instrumental role of the Greek Diaspora and Philhellenes in the Greek Revolution. As always, we encourage you to visit our site, which is in the YouTube description, and see all the great ways that Greece 200 is honoring our past by building our future in celebration of the bicentennial. Tonight's panel is part one of a two-part series discussing the significant contributions of Greek diaspora members to the revolution. Part one will explain the pre-revolutionary era and how the revolution was in large part a product of diaspora philosophies and initiatives. Part two, airing next week, will discuss the diaspora contributions during the revolution itself. We're joined tonight by our hosts of this two-part series, the District 2 Sons of Pericles in the state of Florida, specifically the chapters of West Palm Beach and Fort Lauderdale. Our panelists are George Sofikitis, District 2 Lieutenant Governor and a senior in high school, Kostas Psaradelis, junior in high school, and James Degglesmith, sophomore in high school. So, gentlemen, jumping right into it, let's start by introducing some of the major players we'll be discussing tonight. Who are the main Greek diaspora members that paved the way for the Greek Revolution?
First of all, there is the famous Rigas Pheraios, mostly known for the phrase we always hear in Greek school poems, "Καλύτερα μία ώρα ελεύθερη ζωή παρά 40 χρόνια σκλαβιά και φυλακή." Translated, this basically means it's better to have 1 hour of freedom than 40 years of slavery and prison. This phrase was just part of his war hymn, or Thurios, where he encouraged all Greeks and Balkan Christians to plan a revolt against Ottoman tyranny, and emphasizes the value he put on freedom, something which quickly spread through Greeks soon enough. Piraeus was born in Thessaloniki, but became a diaspora member when he moved to Constantinople, then Bucharest. This was where he learned about and became inspired by the French Revolution. Later in life, he moved to Vienna, Austria, where he was until his death. And we'll discuss later his contributions there.
In addition, there was Adamantios Korais, sometimes called the literary and political architect of modern Greece. Korais was born in Smyrna in the mid-1700s, but later on in life moved to Amsterdam as a merchant, before finally settling in France right before the time of the French Revolution. And before getting into his contributions, an interesting tie-in to the United States is that Korais was actually acquainted with U.S. founding father Thomas Jefferson. The two had met at a dinner party while Jefferson was in France as the U.S. minister to France. Much later on, Korais started thinking about what a modern Greek state would look like and reached out to Jefferson for guidance. The two exchanged letters, and Jefferson wrote the following to Korais. You have certainly begun at the right end towards preparing them for the great object they are now contending for, by improving their minds and qualifying them for self-government. For this, they will owe you lasting honors. Nothing is more likely to forward this object than a study of the fine models of science left by their ancestors, to whom we also are all indebted for the lights which originally led ourselves out of Gothic darkness.
Finally, we'll be talking about the well-known war leader and general Theodoros Kolokotronis. He was born in Messenia and was a clerk and armatolos. He was also a diaspora member. Due to his service in the Russian Navy and his time in the Ionian Islands, which were at the time in French territory. During this time in the Ionian Islands is when he was influenced by the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, saying that the revolution opened the eyes of the world, that people thought that the kings were gods upon the earth. But now, this is the most difficult to rule people. Most of the conversation of Kolokotronis will be during part 2 of the panel. As summary, he was clearly the most prolific war leader of the War of Independence and was eventually appointed commander-in-chief of the Peloponnesian force in 1825.
And so clearly, these three are incredibly important, and each of those introductions was packed with tie-ins and connections that we will explore further. But before that, let's talk about what the Greek diaspora is to begin with, how it came to be, and where the large communities were. So kicking it off, what do we mean when we say Greek diaspora?
The word diaspora has a lot of meanings to it. Nowadays, it's generally a broader term used to describe a community that identifies with their homeland but lives outside of it. Modern Greeks certainly fit that description. We always talk of our connection to the patrida, but being a diaspora has a bit deeper meaning. It begs the question as to how that community left their homeland to begin with. And in many cases, it's a case of fleeing from war and persecution. For the Greeks, this is the case with the first diaspora members fleeing from the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, and continued much more recently with the dispersion and deportation that came with the Greek genocide in the 1910s to the 1920s, and the pogroms in the 1950s.
Of course, and you mentioned the fall of Constantinople. Is that then when the Greek diaspora first came into existence?
Exactly. All the way back in 1453, during the capture of Constantinople by the Ottomans, Greeks began to flee the collapsing Byzantine Empire for other parts of Europe. By the time Peloponnesus fell to the Ottomans in 1460, this quote-unquote stream of immigrants turned into a quote-unquote torrent. Greeks fled the newly occupied territories and became the first of the true Greek diasporas, setting up communities in Europe.
The first and most significant of these diaspora communities was Venice. In a short amount of time, it became known as the most renowned Greek cultural center in Europe, and the community of which Greeks, cultures, and civilization spread throughout the rest of Europe. It was actually in Venice where the first Greek printing press was started and the first Greek book printed. And we'll discuss later just how influential publishing was to the beginning of the Greek Revolution itself.
And how did the diaspora develop over the centuries from the fall of Constantinople to the Greek Revolution?
The diaspora changed drastically during this time, both in the type of Greek that was leaving Greece and where they predominantly went. While the early diaspora was a fleeing of all classes of Greeks to Western Europe, the 1700s brought on a new wave of immigration, mostly merchants who settled in Central Europe and the Northern Balkans.
Largely due to trading arrangements, Greek merchants left Greece for Vienna, Budapest, and Trieste. More for economic reasons, and the movement coincided with Europe's economic revival and the Ottoman Empire's decline. Out of the cities mentioned above, Vienna was the most prominent community, and the diaspora became very powerful and influential there. One diaspora member, George Sina, went on to become the founder of the Austrian National Bank, the first railway company in Austria, and the initiator of steamboat navigation on the Danube River.
Communities also existed elsewhere that were smaller in size but no less influential. In Odessa, Ukraine, at one point, Greeks were 2/3 of the total population. And in Paris, as we'll discuss, the small diaspora community became the center of the revival in Greece, education, and the spreading of revolutionary ideas to Greece.
So, now I think we've established a lot of background and really laid the groundwork for who the diaspora was at the time, what made up the diaspora at that time. But let's start talking about their involvement in the revolution. As we said at the start, we focus in part one of this panel on the pre-revolutionary era. So long before 1821, diaspora members reestablished a Greek national identity using ideas from the Enlightenment era. They spread these revolutionary ideas to the masses, and they provided the needed framework and infrastructure for not only a successful revolution, but most importantly, for the creation of a Greek state that would follow. So how did the diaspora vision for a Greek revolution and modern Greek state come about?
The diaspora Greeks were really the first to reject the rule of the Ottoman Empire, believing it to be, quote, backward, barbaric, and medieval, end quote. Because they didn't live with the Greek occupied territories, they were able to feel the freedom of being outside of Ottoman tyranny and became impressed by the social, cultural, and economic developments at the time in Europe. Wanting these same developments to benefit the Greek people, the Diaspora Greeks soon created a vision of a secular and modern Greek nation, inspired by the French Revolution and Enlightenment. With this line of thinking, the Diaspora Greeks set out to restart the fire of Greek national pride and patriotism.
And once this vision of a modern Greece came about, it of course had to be implemented. So how did the Greek diaspora succeed in doing so?
Their first and very significant contribution was reestablishing the Greek identity. Before any conversations on a physical revolution began, there had to be a sort of cultural evolution. What bound Greeks together, and what did it mean to be Greek? Until the diaspora got involved, Greek, quote unquote, Greekness was really just a way of defining Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire and describing the language used predominantly by the Orthodox Church. It was the diaspora Greeks who came along and reinvented the idea of Hellenism. They used the proud history of ancient Greece as their starting point and recaptured that great ancient civilization to establish the foundation for modern Greece.
And why use ancient Greece? I mean, of course, us in the modern day, we always go back to, heroes of ancient Greece, obviously Aristotle and Plato, and of course Pericles, and we think on them with pride. But what was the diaspora intention in using this history?
The use of ancient Greece by the diaspora was the real key to success at the time. For one, it acted as a bridge between the influential civilization of ancient Greece and the new modern Greece that was envisioned. It reminded modern Greeks of their ancient successes, reinvigorated Hellenism, and as some historians have mentioned, it reminded Greece that despite their Ottoman rulers to the east, the contributions of ancient Greece to the west made them the most European of all European lands.
Another important note is that the use of ancient Greece allowed the diaspora to establish a culture and identity organically. The diaspora was heavily influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment and the rest of Europe. But rather than force feed these ideas to the Greeks, the quote, Hellenization of these ideas, through the use of ancient Greek ideals allowed for Greeks to absorb these ideas and empowered them to make these ideas their own.
And we know now how stubborn modern day Greeks are. So of course it was really important to make things organic and make sure that everybody thought Hellenization was their idea in their own way. And that's the process you're describing, George, has really been called a re-Hellenization. And we now know the starting point of this process and its framework, but let's discuss how they accomplished this. It's clear that the focus of the time was on establishing a Hellenic identity and spreading that identity to the masses. What we found is that the diaspora Greeks ensured that the identity would be not only established, but widely shared through the masses. And they did so through three things: publishing, education, and language. So let's start with publishing. What was the diaspora's role in it?
The Greek diaspora had a huge role in creating books, articles, and other publications. As we said earlier, the first Greek printing press was in Venice, and by the 1700s, Vienna and Paris became publishing capitals of the diaspora for the diaspora. You can even see the changes in quantity and content over that century. During the 1700s, the total amount of books published rose from 107 to 750, and the content went from being 80% religion to being split 60-40 between religious and secular topics.
Besides books, Vienna and Paris were home of the lots of newspapers and periodicals. The first Greek newspaper was actually established in Vienna, called Ephemidis, and was circulated widely both within and outside of Greece.
And what was the significance of having all these publications?
It helped spread information. Ephemeris, for example, was the main way that information about the French Revolution spread to Greece at the time. Many diaspora members wrote in these papers and periodicals, sharing their understanding of European social and political developments, as well as allowing a forum for ideological discussions to be held. These forums are where the initial formation of the new cultural, linguistic, and ethnic Greek identity were formed.
And that's a perfect transition there because you mentioned that a large part of the new Greek identity was linguistic. Language was likely used as a tool for creating this new Greek identity, but how was that accomplished?
Early on, the relationship between language and nationality was a big talking point throughout Europe. Many intellectuals became really focused on the connection between the two. For the Greek language, they started specifically with the Diaspora in Paris. They believed that the Greek language could be used as a basis to reestablish the Greek identity. From their perspective, it accomplished a few things. 1, it allowed for a bridge between ancient and modern Greeks. 2, it served as a vehicle of national awakening and political education. And 3, it created a natural bond that could unite all Greeks, despite their social status, class, or education level.
And who were the major drivers of these initiatives?
Once again, Korais, the central role. He strongly believed that the Greek language would be the centerpiece for our new Greek identity. As he stated, the character of our whole nation may be known for the language. So Korais took on the challenge task of creating a new Greek language. The new language blended together ancient Greek and modern Greek. Both the modern language spoken by well-educated and common vernacular spoken by the masses. The new language called Katharavusa, or purest Greek, was in the eyes of Korais a new common language, bridging past and present, and connecting people of all social statuses.
Method clearly worked too, as Katharevusa was adopted as the official language of the Greek state in 1821 and was used all the way up until 1976, when it was replaced by the current official language, Demotic Greek. Noting the success of Korais and Katharevusa, historians believe that the creation of this new language and the more general cultural reform program, quote, prepared the ground for the Greek Revolution and, quote, set the guidelines for the formation of the modern Greek state.
So clearly language was a big factor, and we already know that publishing allowed the diaspora to spread these new identities. But what else solidified so firmly this notion of a new Greek identity?
One of the biggest undiscussed factors is education, and of course, Korais was the main contributor. Korais, like a lot of other diaspora members, believed that it was important that education be accessible for everyone, that schools be open, quote, to the rich as well as to the poor, and their teachers be chosen on the strength of their patriotism and their knowledge of ancient and modern Greek.
So a real technocracy then, one which empowered everyone and not just an elite few. That's of course a great notion, but how did he accomplish this?
Schools were created all over Greece by the Diaspora, with their guidance and also direct financing. The schools taught in the Katharavusa and existed in all major towns on the mainland, many Aegean islands, and even parts of Asia Minor, like Smyrna and Apali. It was at these schools that students became exposed to the new maths and science like physics, algebra, and geometry. They also learned about Enlightenment advancements in literature, philosophy, and political science.
Aside from the schools themselves, the Diaspora Greeks also financed plenty of Greek students in cultural centers of Europe and aided in the establishment of public libraries in the occupied territories. The Diaspora contributions to education even got praised by foreign observers, where they noted that the ability of the Greeks to educate themselves might be, quote, the mighty force, end quote, that destined them to, quote, break the yoke of Ottoman tyranny, end quote.
And of course, all these ideas, all this establishment of a new identity, the spreading of these ideas through publishing and education, this was important just to start the revolution and just to try to have a successful revolution. But from very early on, what was most impressive was that the Greeks had the foresight in the diaspora to think about what a Greek nation would look like if the revolution was successful. So what was the view of the diaspora in this regard?
This was a big point of contention, actually. There were two competing ideas of what modern Greece should look like. One idea was that Greece should be a reborn Byzantine empire. In this scenario, Greek revolution would overthrow the Ottoman Empire and leave Greeks at the head of the new empire. Others believe that a modern Greece would be an independent nation state ruled as a republic.
I mean, we know which of these ended up happening, right? And who supported, though, each of these ideas, and how did the winning idea emerge?
The competition between these two ideas led to a lot of internal conflict. The new Byzantium philosophy was supported mostly by the Orthodox Church and the Phanariotes.
And since we haven't really discussed Phanariotes yet, for those who don't know, Phanariotes were generally members of prominent and wealthy Greek families who, in the time of the Ottoman Empire, held high political and/or administrative positions.
Exactly. So these groups supported a new Byzantium, and in a lot of ways already put in practice these ideas of a monarchy. The Orthodox Church was largely self-governing in the Ottoman Empire and had a lot of authority over the masses. And many Phanariotes, especially those in Moldavia and Wallachia, were more like princes in self-governed territories. So it was likely easier for them to imagine a new Greek system that worked very similarly.
The Greek diaspora, on the other hand, was very much in favor of an independent nation state of Greece. It was an idea that was passed down all the way from the Greeks during the fall of Constantinople and was rekindled with the new publishings and translations of the modern diaspora. From their perspective, the Byzantine legacy was one that they opposed, believing that the classic philosophies born in the Athens of Pericles were, quote, eclipsed in the dark Christian Middle Ages, end quote, and, quote, reborn in Italy with the Renaissance, end quote.
This unfortunately led to the eternal conflict between the diaspora on one side and the Phanariotes and the church on the other. Very early on, the diaspora believed that the Phanariotes and church got special treatment from the Ottoman Empire and supported the empire to maintain their position. Independent observers have noted that these groups were able to carve out a nice position in the existing empire and accumulate wealth and live well, leaving them little motivation to change anything. In the early 1810s, one examiner wrote that a revolution would actually be very unlikely because while the masses had motivation and spirit to attempt a revolt, the higher class and clergy were apparently willing to acquiesce in their present condition.
Meanwhile, the church and the Phanariotes both heavily criticized the diaspora for their liberal ideas, believing the Enlightenment ideas of Europe were a negative influence. Some Phanariotes dissuaded their sons from traveling to Europe, while the church criticized many of the school books provided by the diaspora as written in a barbaric language and teaching young people, quote, injurious forms of government and degenerate morals, end quote. Even the famous Phanariote, Mavrokordatos, wrote the following about exposure to European ideals. It, quote, often leads to the corruption of the ancestral customs that adorn our nation. I have often deplored the fact that Greeks who have gone abroad have not only acquired disgusting and spurious manners, but have also polluted their minds with alien doctrines and have drawn thousands of simple souls into the same abominations. Would that they had suffered shipwreck upon their departure, end quote.
And I mean, in past panels, we've seen that the theme of internal conflict is nothing new, so it's not surprising, but what's really important is that this idea that the diaspora had of an independent nation state governed by a republic was coming to fruition. That's the one that actually won the day. And so let's detail that idea more.
Korais held this idea, thinking that any Greek state should be modern and secular, capable of joining the larger European community. But the first proponent of the idea, not surprisingly, was Pheraios. His hope was that the revolution would be a revolution of the people and it would lead to a new Hellenic republic with Greek as the official language. He envisioned a multiracial state that functioned as a republic and would protect the rights of all individuals and ethnic groups. A lot of his writings in Vienna addressed this, including writings titled the, quote, Constitution and Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, end quote.
Right. And I mean, all this framework we discussed then, it was laid out by the Greek Diaspora, though, decades before the Greek Revolution itself began. But it's clear that with these contributions, a Hellenic identity was established, and the idea for what a modern Greece would look like was heavily formed. But how do we get from this time to the revolution? How did this translate into the war itself?
Even before the war, countless revolts had already occurred. Diaz, for example, planned a revolt in early 1796 and even found some supporters in Vienna. But his plans were found out by the Ottomans, and he was arrested and put to death. He became known as a martyr for this and inspired countless others for sacrifice for the Greek cause, many singing the war hymn throughout.
Even Kolokotronis planned an initial revolt before 1821. While he was in the Ionian Islands, he, along with some exiled Suliotes, coordinated with an Albanian chief to take back Peloponnnesos and expected assistance from Russia. Unfortunately, they never got the help they expected, and ultimately the revolt failed.
So, Greeks fighting against the tyranny of the Ottoman Empire really wasn't unique to 1821. It's said in some areas that, from the time of the fall of Constantinople, you could expect a Greek uprising once or twice per generation. What seemed to change as the revolution drew near is that, with the Greek identity established, people were able to unite with a common bond much more easily. The countless papers and books published allowed for these ideas to spread more effectively. And maybe most importantly, the resources provided by the diaspora placed confidence in the people that maybe this time would be more successful than the many prior uprisings before.
All these culminated in one of the most significant diaspora contributions, forming a secret society which allowed for a communication network and central command for the revolution, complete with secret signs and rituals similar to Sons of Pericles, and requiring each member to pledge their fortunes, honors, and lives to a free Greece. It was in 1814 in Odessa, where the Filiki Itaira was formed.
I think that's a great place to stop. So we'll cover more of the formation of the Filiki Eteria leading up to the revolution itself in part 2, which will air next week. But as a final question to each of you, and it's a two-part question, what was the biggest contribution of the Greek diaspora to the revolution, and what significance should modern-day Greek diaspora members take from this?
I'd say the identity that is being Greek and having the Greek heritage would definitely be considered as one of the debated driving forces of the revolution. These very ideals and pride that we have are still alive today in many forms, especially when the modern generations attempt to connect back to their heritage. Ideals like Philotimo live to this very day in all generations.
The biggest contribution of the Greek diaspora to the revolution was the confidence that their help inspired. And modern-day diaspora members should be proud of their Hellenic culture because, as we saw, we weren't always able to celebrate it.
This whole conversation was about presenting our identity. The Greek language, dancing, food, and even the flag behind me. It's all symbol of our culture. And that culture is something that came out of the diaspora contributions.
Well said, guys. And thank you all for your contributions to this panel. Thank you for your participation. As we said, part 2 of this panel, again, hosted by the District 2 Sons of Pericles, this time the Orlando and other chapters that may join. We will air that next week, but in the meantime, please again check out bicentennialgreece.org for all of our new initiatives and programs. Keep updated on our many more panels coming in as we again continue honoring our past by building our future in celebration of the Greek bicentennial. Thank you, guys.
Thank
I have a
you
quick
for having us.